Welcome to this seminar by Nygaard Jedzini, and is a PhD candidate here at the Centre, funded by the Australian Research Council Special Research Initiative. Anne will talk for half an hour, which will be recorded. This will be followed by some comments from our discussants, and we are very lucky to have Dr. Nivek Thompson as one of her discussants, who is obviously a friend of the Centre. She's collaborated with us on so many projects, and Kyle Redman from the New Democracy Foundation. And I think this is really a good bridge because it situates Anne's work, not just with academic work, but also with practice. And having Kyle from New Democracy Foundation is very welcome, and he's very busy, so we are so thrilled that he accepted our invitation. Just as a reminder to the group, this is a work in progress seminar, and the spirit of a work in progress seminar is not to take apart or grill Anne, but really to brainstorm together on how Anne's dissertation can improve in the next year and a half, after which she will submit.
9 months.
All right, so Anne, over to you.
Right, so a warm welcome everyone to my work in progress seminar. So as Nicole just said, today I'm presenting what is supposed to be my theoretical framework for my dissertation, and it's titled Unpacking Power and Democratic Innovations, a systematic review of how power is shared in Australian local government. So just a very quick overview of what we'll be going through for the next roughly 30 minutes. So I'll start out by setting the scene and sharing my aim of the presentation, which is essentially also the aim of this chapter, my theoretical framework. Up next, I'll present my argument, and then why I believe that studying deliberative power sharing is important, but also really relevant for our field. And then I'll contextualize deliberative power sharing in Australian local governments very shortly, and then move into the more theoretical part of the framework in the presentation today, which is understanding power through Rainer Forrest and Mary Parker Follett, two power theorists I've just been obsessed with and continue to be obsessed with. I'm very fascinated by their work. And once I've gone through that, towards the end, I will combine Forrest and Follett's two power theories, and from there be able to conceptualize deliberative power sharing, and then finally try to operationalize deliberative power sharing in Participedia, in which I've done my systematic review in Australian local governments. And then finally, to conclude the presentation, I'll share some preliminary reflections on my findings and how these speak to my ongoing fieldwork. Right, so the aim of my presentation and my theoretical framework is basically to conceptualize what I call deliberative power sharing. And I do this again by examining the case of democratic innovations in Australian local governments. The aim is also really for me to advance the theoretical constructions of power sharing, and then how these can be operationalized in empirical contexts, but again, specifically in Australian local governments. So I do this by answering the following two sub-research questions, which I developed for my theoretical framework, which are what are the current theoretical constructions of power sharing, and what are the features, and then how can deliberative power sharing be operationalized in empirical contexts in Australian local governments. So what is my argument in my theoretical framework? Well, I argue that we need a nuanced understanding, essentially, of how Australian local governments share power with community members through democratic innovations. And this argument is largely built on my systematic review of how power is shared in Australian local governments, catalogued in Participedia. So just have that in mind. So based on this argument, I claim that deliberative power sharing can potentially increase legitimacy in political decisions for councillors, but then at the same time also contribute to higher trust for community members in councillors and local government institutions. And other scholars in our field, like Nissen, have also made quite a similar argument. So in my theoretical framework, I define deliberative power sharing as the cognitive interactions between people, processes, and institutions, in which the collective decision-making power to impact common good outcomes is distributed jointly and equally through reason giving. And this is a definition I have come up with mainly based on my readings and analysis of Follett and Forrest's work. So while I studied deliberative power sharing, there's already a very rich empirical literature on the conferring of power to democratic innovations and what politicians view is what the view of politicians is of that. So for some politicians, they consider the conferring of power to democratic innovations as a threat of the legitimacy of representative politics, where power sharing really is considered a zero-sum game. So not even giving up all power, but just some power actually for some politicians equals losing power, giving up power altogether. And actually, that kind of perception makes community members more democratically and more politically dissatisfied, which we also have seen in some empirical studies. But then we also seen empirical studies that point to or indicate that that doesn't actually necessarily mean either that community members, they want complete decision-making power in democratic innovations. So there's also been a lot of empirical studies into whether politicians and community members can deliberate together. And the short answer is they can, but there are obviously some challenges, and then also depending on the level of government in which that deliberation takes place. So if we here look specifically at the empirical studies that have been done at the local government level, they point to the deliberations between councillors and community members actually can lead to positive outcomes. So one of the main reasons for that is that councillors, they don't just receive an external input from deliberating community members, which is, for example, what we see in citizen juries, where there are some recommendations developed and they're being handed over to the councillors. But here, community members, they actually deliberate and they work closely together with councillors to develop new policies and make joint policy recommendations for the local government. So as to contextualize deliberative power sharing in Australian local governments, Australia is a trailblazer in, I should say, representative deliberative processes, because that's actually what the OECD study is on. But I use and refer to democratic innovations as an umbrella term in my dissertation, because I'm not just looking at representative deliberative processes. I'm looking at innovative ways in which local governments engage with community members more broadly. So these representative deliberative processes, they're often mostly consultative, which means that they don't give community members any binding decision-making power, and neither do they require councillors to implement community members' recommendations. And there are different opinions on that in our field of deliberative democracy. So what I argue is that deliberative power sharing, based on this, basically offers a new and a more democratic, legitimate approach to trust building and shared decision-making power between councillors and community members in Australian local governments. Right, so up next, let's try to understand power through rainforest and Parker Follett. I'm not sure why the photo of rainforest is not as good as it looked when I downloaded it, but anyway, yeah. So my approach to conceptualizing deliberative power sharing begins by, again, analytically linking two quite distinct, but at the same time also very complementary conceptualizations of power. And the first, again, is rainforests, nominal power, or the power of justifications. And the second is Parker Follett's power will as a coactive form of power. So Forrest and Follett's concepts of power, they are useful because they bridge two key features of power that are relevant for the study of power sharing and deliberation in democratic and political institutions such as Australian local governments. And these features are, again, the cognitive aspect of power, the space of reasons, and the collective power of joint will formation and action of the group towards a common goal or outcome. So in Forrest's concept of power and nominal power, Forrest, he argues that to understand what power is and how power is exercised, its nominal nature needs to be understood first. And by nominal, or nominal nature, I should say, he refers to the cognitive nature, essentially, of power. So the cognitive aspect of power is what Forrest, he also terms, again, the space of reasons or the realm of justifications. And he defines nominal power as justifications, and justifications that can be either good or bad, or even both, that move an actor through the process of what he calls acceptance. Right, so in my reading of Rainer Forrest's nominal power, I identified three key theoretical constructions that make up nominal power, which are rule, coercion, and domination, narratives, justifications, and then social structures and the four aspects of nominal power. And I'll do my best to unpack each of these very briefly, so just keep that in mind. So on rule, coercion, and domination, what is really central here to Forrest's concept of nominal power is that power can be either constraining or liberating. So he points out that the difference from rule, coercion, and domination is when, if we take an example of a military tank, and this is an example he refers to, so where the actor sees the military tank as constraining or liberating. So Forrest explains that the military tank might be an objective threat, but it only has power over the actor when the actor fears it. So that means if the actor sees the military tank as an enemy, but doesn't fear the military tank has lost its nominal power over the actor. So to use Forrest's own words, it has physical force over you, but no longer any human normative power guiding your thoughts. A narrative of justification, what is really at the core of Forrest's argument for a neutral evaluation of power as to that the very meaning of power is not positive or negative, again, because it's about the process of acceptance through reason giving. So what he's saying here is that power only exists, again, when there is acceptance, and whether this is by choice or force, so to speak, or without question of the justifications that are used by the reason giver. So it's exactly through the nature and the quality, and then also the legitimacy of the justifications used that can lead to tensions in social relations between agent and reason giver. And the type of justifications that Forrest he refers to, they're not necessarily actually acceptable, or nor reflexively constructed, or even tested from a critical point of view, he's saying. So what Forrest instead he refers to by justifications is a so-called impure space or nominal space of what people see as justified for good or for bad reasons. So finally, on social orders, the realism of Forrest's conceptualization of power as narratives and justifications is really tested in terms of whether it can actually explain power structures. So that can be in an institution, an organization, like local governments here in Australia, but it can actually also be in more general social structures in society at large. So according to Forrest, power structures can't explain how people who are subjected to forms of institutional forces or institutional violence act or behave the way they do. But what can explain this are the structures that presupposes acceptance of what the rules and justifications people who operate within those structures are subjected to. And these rules and justifications, they can include certain ideas and notions about, for example, poverty, fairness, cooperation, and efficiency. Right, moving on. So nominal power has been linked with deliberative democracy more broadly, our field, but then the study of power reasons has also been linked with deliberation specifically. And Rainer Forrest has actually made that link himself. Casillo has also made that link. And of course, our very own Nicole Corrado, who we're very fortunate to have here with us, her and or your co-authors, I should say, Hammond and Min, in your book Power and Deliberative Democracy from 2019, you have specifically linked Forrest's concept of nominal power with the distribution of deliberative power in what Corrado, Hammond, and Min call formal spheres of public deliberation, such as in representative politics, which is very relevant for my dissertation and my theoretical framework specifically, because I'm looking at deliberative power sharing in democratic innovations in representative politics in the local governments here in Australia. So on the applicability of Forrest's concept of nominal power in the study of deliberative power, Corrado, Hammond, and Min explain the normative ambivalence of practice of power demands a lens by which that can be evaluated based on deliberative democratic terms. Forrest makes the case for analyzing power along a spectrum. On one end are exercises on nominal power through the justificatory quality of reasons shared among deliberating persons, and on the other end, the limiting case of its exercise by way of physical forests. So Forrest's spectrum overlaps with deliberative democracy's account, again, of authenticity, which prices the power of persuasion over coercion. So if we move on to Follett's concept of power, power will, so Follett, she argues that, first of all, I should say, she was actually not really interested in how to so-called like take power. Instead, she was interested in how to generate power and how to increase power through the generation of it, and thereby be able to share power through social relations and organizations. And Follett, she defines power will as a jointly developed power, a coactive, not a coercive power. So power will to Follett is the only genuine and therefore also the only legitimate form of power. So from Follett's perspective, all forms of power over are considered coercion and therefore illegitimate in her view. So a bit similar to Forrest, Follett, she also separates the very concept of power from control, and then for her also authority, but she doesn't per se actually argue for a neutral evaluation or definition of power, but she defines power in very broad terms as the ability to make things happen or to initiate change. So similar to Forrest, Follett also identified three key theoretical constructions of power with, which are integration and the law of the situation and functional unity. So just again, very briefly on these three key theoretical constructions. So on integration, Follett's key point is that integration of difference is central to the generation of power with. An integration of difference between workers and managers. Again, Follett was a business consultant, so that's, again, she studied power in organizational contexts. But if you think about councillors and community members, perhaps here in this context, so that's achieved through what she called circular behavior. And this is what Follett refers to as influence, which is really when an individual or a group has power over another individual or another group. That also has power over. So through workers and managers' ability to influence each other equally, circular behavior is created and power will can thereby be generated. So if we look at the law of the situation, Follett, she argues that by taking orders from the situation, the issue of giving and receiving orders actually doesn't exist. So workers' job is not to give orders, but to find the order that is integral to a given situation. And that way, all workers, they actually accept the order if they consider the order one, and therefore they can also exercise that order themselves, regardless of their level of position in the business organization. And it's not to say that the law situation cannot evolve and can't change, and therefore also the law situation or the order that workers adhere to also can change. So Follett here, she points out that friction is inevitable when it comes to the law situation, but those that are impacted by the friction at least understand it and therefore agree on the situation it arises from. So finally, on functional unity, again, Follett was a business consultant and she went out and did a lot of observations. So in these observations, you noticed how few organizational problems really are independent from one another, or are independent of one another. So these observations made her argue that organizational problems really are intertwined. So in functional unity, she explains that for workers to have an intelligent understanding of their department's problems in the organization, they need to also understand the problems of their fellow workers in their departments. So on the department's problems, they cannot be understood separately to the other department's problems. And this is why workers, they need to possess knowledge about all the department's problems in the organization, including general knowledge about the organization, and then also the overall policies of the organization. Right, so similar to Forrest, Follett's concept of power will has also been bridged with the field of deliberative democracy and democratic innovations. It has been done by one of our great colleagues here at the Center, Carolyn Hendricks, and it has also been done by our other great colleagues from the US, Mark Warren and Jay Mansbridge, which particularly have made the bridge between power with and the importance of negotiation and consensus building in deliberations in representative politics. And then some of my Danish colleagues, which also know our colleagues here at the Center, Jakob Torfinger and Eva Sørensen, they have also bridged Follett's concept of power with, but with the positive role of deliberation in political leadership and equal power distribution between politicians and public actors in collaborative decision-making processes. Right, so trying to combine Forrest and Follett. Well, obviously there are some theoretical compatibilities here. So the two theories merge cognitive power with coactive power. And given I'm looking at deliberative power sharing, so I'm looking at, again, how power can be shared through deliberation in an organizational context. I believe that these two theories are suitable from a theoretical framework. And also there are very few theories actually of power with out there. I did a quite extensive literature review, which I'm obviously not presenting today, but again, to make sure I uncovered and identified the most suitable theories from a framework. So neither of the two theories can really individually be applied to understand the concept and the context of deliberative power sharing. Again, there's naturally also a lot of theoretical opposition in Forrest and Follett's two theories. And I guess like the main opposition is their disagreement of the meaning of power, but perhaps I guess more specifically, their disagreement on what's considered legitimate and illegitimate power. So this difference makes it very difficult to examine and explain the phenomenon of the sharing of deliberative power. Right, so based on Forrest and Follett, I propose the concept of deliberative power sharing, which I will outline here in a second. So I come up with 5 key theoretical features, if you will, of what I consider to be a part of deliberative power sharing, and just keep in mind these are not complete work. So the first is democratic justification, and then justified deliberative power, contextualized empowerment, and then equitable conflict resolution and shared responsibility. So on democratic justification, Forrest, he highlights that democratic rule only exists when those who are subjected to a normative order, such as community members, for example, also are the normative authorities who co-decide, for example, with local governments or councillors, such order through democratic justification procedures. So democratic power, Forrest, he points out, is exercised through justifiable reasons about fundamental rights of justice. And in those situations where asymmetrical social relations are not justified and therefore not legitimate, but might still appear legitimate because the space of reasons is sealed off, democratic justification is no longer present. So that means coercion then enters the pictures, and those who are subjected to power are prevented from justifying it because the space of reasons is being limited. And this position matches quite well with Follett. So Follett points out that the importance of participation to have cooperation among workers or among different groups of people, such as councillors and community members. And Follett stresses that democracy is about, quote, the fruitful relating and the interactions and co-functioning of bringing about the type of organization that supports co-functioning. So in this case, it would be Australian local government. So through the generated commitment of shared purposes and pluralistic responsibility of democracy, people like councillors and community members are held accountable by joint and top-down control in democratic and political processes and institutions, such as Australian local governments. So unjustified deliberative power, Forrest states that power must be analysed along a spectrum, which we also heard from Nicole and Nicole's co-authors, that extends across the exercise of the justificatory quality of reasons among deliberating people, such as councillors and community members, to the exercise, again, of physical force outside the realm of justifications. So according to Forrest, in a liberal democracy based on public reason, as Australia, for example, what is really fundamental to this public reason is that it's considered reasonable. So these reasons are neutral to the extent that they are independent from the different ethical doctrines of the good, but they're not morally neutral, as they, from the perspective of Forrest, are moral reasons that hold the legitimacy of what generally is considered right. So it's the basic capacity of reason which makes deliberating people distinguish between what is ethically good, which reasonable people can disagree on, and what is morally right, and which people cannot have fundamental reasonable disagreement. Follett calls here for the importance of public deliberation in political decision-making at the local government level. So she believes that democracy grows out of contention and integration in local communities as opposed to in legislative bodies. And Follett considers conference or committee for deliberation as opposed to primarily for voting as a way to pool knowledge together, form judgment, and develop purposes. So by bringing these different elements together, she calls for people like councillors and community members to look at all sides of the situations, and then use not only these to guide conference or committee, but actually justify deliberation. Right, so I better make sure I don't go over time. Yeah, it's all right. So I'm almost done here. So on conceptualized empowerment, Forrest points out that we need to think about forms of power that, quote, empower and ground a different practice of freedom that is powerful because it leaves the definition of freedom to the individuals themselves, a freedom that is not free from power, but is more free from given forms of subordination and normalization. So Follett here, she refers to the importance and relevance of the law of the situation, as we also heard previously. And this is her attempt to avoid two extremes. So like giving orders, giving no orders at all. She suggests to what she calls depersonalize the giving of orders, and doing that by uniting all the people who are concerned with the situation, identify the law of the situation, and then follow that. On equitable conflict resolution, Forrest, he highlights that the concepts, again, of power and will, coercion, and domination, they need to be distinguished from each other. And he explains that it otherwise is very difficult to determine what is legitimate and illegitimate power, and therefore also what is considered a conflict. So he stresses that an imposition of the will in any given conflict or wills is always an exercise of power, but that this power paradigm is more closely aligned with the concept of domination. So if there's no agreement really on what is viewed as legitimate and illegitimate power, it will be really difficult to find an agreement on what is considered conflict in disagreements among deliberating councillors and community members, and therefore also be able to come up with a resolution or a solution to that conflict. And Follett here, she brings attention to the integration of difference. So she doesn't, again, perceive conflict as either good or bad, but actually as the natural difference really between people. And she believes that conflict is a human condition of existing, and it cannot be eliminated. So she instead argues that it should be used to the advantage of the collective of the people. And Follett here, she distinguishes between different modes of dealing with conflict and breaks it into three separate categories. domination, compromise, and integration. And whereas domination and compromise have clear winner and losers, integration means that the solution has been identified, but all desires of the people who are affected by the situation have met. So very quickly on the final one, and then we can cover it in the questions as well. So Forrest states the power is not only exercised by an overfree agent, because it's also the word of what is going on when someone acts for certain reasons, which others are responsible for. So for Follett here, she points out that everyone needs to be responsible, loyal, and obedient to the functional unity. And according to her, in the functional unity, everyone has a function, and that function corresponds with each person's capacity. And that way, no one will have greater authority and responsibility than the one that go with their freedom. So I think we'll just leave it in that, and then we can cover that more in the questions. So trying to operationalize deliberative power sharing in Participedia. So I reviewed a total of 34 cases, 34 Australian local government cases in Participedia. And I'll get to in a second what questions I asked for this analysis and how that links with my the theorizing of deliberative power sharing. But I identified 4 ways of sharing power between Australian local governments and community members, which are deliberative power sharing and the sharing of power with deliberation, power sharing with deliberative elements, and deliberation with limited to no sharing of power. So of all the 34 cases, I only identified 1 case that's considered to be deliberative power sharing. And a case example is case number 14, which is the Bayern model in 2019. For the sharing of power with deliberation, I identified 12 cases. And then for power sharing with deliberative elements, I identified 3 cases. And again, then 5 cases were identified for deliberation with limited to no sharing of power. So that means there are 13 cases that I was actually not able to identify because, and I'll get back to this in a second as well in terms of the limitations of using Participedia. So this is where the data was incomplete or missing, and I was not able to determine what type of power was shared. Right. So these were some of the analytical questions that I used to guide my systematic review. So first of all, I was looking at, is there deliberation in this process? And then secondly, I looked at what type of power is shared, and then who is sharing power to whom, how is power shared, how long is power shared, and what is the impact of the power shared. And then some of the other, I guess, analytical design features I looked at in the systematic review included the project and the design a bit more broadly, the location and the year, the topic and aim of the process, the funding, the organization and facilitation, and then what type of process, mini-public, co-design, etc. And then also look at the recruitment type. So in terms of the empirical manifestation of deliberative power sharing, so again, as I just mentioned, the Bayern model from 2019 is really the only case I've been able to identify that, based on the work I've been doing so far, I consider to be a case of deliberative power sharing. So based on the review, I identified 8 key features that really that encapsulates, I guess, the sharing of power through deliberation. So first of all, for a process to be considered deliberative power sharing, it has to be long-form deliberation and considered high scale. So this is, again, a scale of measuring deliberation that Deliberative Democracy practitioner Mosaic Lab from Victoria has developed that I used. And then there has to be deliberation, not just internally between citizens, for example, but between councillors, citizens, and community stakeholders. So in the third point here, it says deliberation is internally. So there's deliberation internally in the group with the councillors, the citizens, and the community stakeholders. But there's also deliberation across all of those 3 groups. And then the deliberating main groups here, they're also part of a broader engagement process that then feeds into these 3 main groups deliberating. And that can be through, again, community session, discussion workshops, a deliberative forum for underrepresented groups, such as Indigenous people, for example, or elderly, and then also community surveys. And deliberation has to be a part of the broader community engagement process as well. So it's not just enough that there's deliberation in the 3 main groups. There has to be a deliberation as well in the broader community engagement process, as in the deliberative forum, for example. And then all citizens then need to have equal opportunity and access to participate as well in the process. And then all recommendations have to be adopted and responded to by council. And then this type of process, which is considered deliberative power sharing, are typically a deliberative co-design or co-creation process, as in the case of Bayern, and includes rotation of at least one deliberating group, which for Bayern was the citizens group. So just gotta check on the time. So
3 minutes.
yeah, so I have developed the, let's just look at them very quickly. So I have developed the 4 forms, or the remaining 3 forms, I should say, of power sharing, which we can cover and look at in the questions that we're thinking. So they're at the back here of these slides. So I think I'll just conclude by speaking a little bit to the reflections I have had as a part of this process. So obviously, again, there's a lot of fine-tuning that needs to go into the concept of deliberative power sharing, and it has to be reflected in the systematic review and the 4 ways of sharing power. I actually did the Participedia review before I did my conceptualization of deliberative power sharing. And then, as I was saying, there are clear limitations in using Participedia because, again, data is incomplete or missing. And then I think I've been thinking a lot about is that normative ideals are really important. Again, deliberative power sharing is a normative ideal of sharing power, but how do we also, as scholars, make that relevant for practice, given, in my case, I'm engaging and working with deliberative democracy organizations here, but then also specifically with local governments. So in terms of my ongoing fieldwork, at this point, I have done 16 interviews with councillors, public servants, and community members in Bayern Shire Council and Yarra City Council. So I'm doing a comparative case study of 3 councils, which includes Mornington Peninsula Shire Council, and where I'm about to do my interviews here in November. And I guess the key finding really is that so far is that deliberative power sharing is definitely not happening as a normative ideal in the local governments or the councils I have interviewed so far. Yeah, again, and I can come back to that. There might be some elements of the sharing of power, and yeah, there might be some elements again of deliberation, but it is not as ambitious, I guess, as these different models that I developed. So again, is deliberative power sharing really ambitious or utopian? I think that's something that's really worth thinking about in terms of I'm looking at power sharing in representative politics, and again, the view of a lot of politicians, including councillors, is that they're the ones that have been elected, and therefore they're the ones that can make the decisions and not necessarily include all community members, at least in the decision-making processes. So just some very brief reflections. So thank you so much, everyone, for listening. And then the most important slides of the entire presentation, before we move on to the Q&A, this slide behind every PhD candidate, some superhumans and super scholars. Nicole and Selin, thank you so much. Particularly thank you to you, Nicole, for helping me so much with my framework. And thank you for your support, Selin. And then, of course, also, it takes a village, a lot of blood, sweat, and laughs, and gin for some people as well. Yeah, again, I couldn't have done it with all the support. And also, of course, from Olivia and Lucas and Shavi and all our wonderful postdocs.
Amazing.
Special thanks to Democracy in Mosaic Lab. Democracy in Mosaic Lab helped me with my recruitment in Farn, Shire Council in Northern Rivers, New South Wales. And Mosaic Lab have helped me with my recruitment in Mornington, in Victoria. So thank you so much, everyone.